welcome. We are so excited to have everyone here today for this discussion. My name is Elizabeth Wilkins, and I'm President and CEO here at Roosevelt. And so delighted to have all of you with us here today. At the end of April, we released an essay collection called Restoring Economic Democracy: Progressive Ideas for Stability and Prosperity. Our goal was to bring great minds together and imagine how democracy can better deliver the economy that Americans need and want. An economy that offers security and agency, an economy that enables us to live lives of meaning and purpose. For decades, Americans have clamored for that kind of economy and have been frustrated by unmet expectations. As a result, they've increasingly lost faith in democracy as a system, to the point that some are willing to gamble on a wrecking ball rather than wait for further good intentions or incremental reforms to fall short. What we've seen so far from the Trump administration in these last few months is not what Americans bargained for. They've watched unelected billionaires tear down our public institutions and put the essential pillars of our social contract in their crosshairs. They're seeing rampant corruption and self-dealing for the few rather than prosperity for the many. We are watching destruction of the old, but a failure to build anew. Now is the time to show people that a better path is possible. Our essay collection begins to do just that, and we've got two of our esteemed authors with us today to talk about where we go from here. Their essays frame our collection, grounding us in reminders of what people want from their communities and from their working lives. That's the right place to start when talking about our economy and our democracy. Let me introduce our speakers. Senator Chris Murphy is the junior senator from Connecticut, and he has been a powerful voice in explaining the dangers of this moment and pointing a way forward to a politics of deeper meaning. In his essay for the collection, he argues that the good life starts by rebuilding power, vitality, and connection at the community level and standing up to concentrated power. Osita Nwanevu is a contributing editor at The New Republic and a columnist at The Guardian. He's got a new book coming out this August called The Right of the People: Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding. And his essay for this collection previews some of the book's central arguments. As he writes in his essay, quote, "Democracy isn't an ideal that American people should be weighing against their economic well-being. It's an ideal that can economically empower them. Joining our commitment to political democracy with a commitment to, quote, economic democracy, an economy controlled by the many and not by the few." So on that note, let me turn it over to Osita and Senator Murphy to get the conversation started.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And Senator Murphy, it is so great to have you here. I just wanted to say before we get started that in the moment when people are really looking for leadership, really looking for vision, it's great to see you out there every day talking not just about what's going on in the headlines, but about the principles that should animate our politics. Politicians aren't really often rewarded for talking big about ideas and being intellectually serious, but I really hope you are. It's great to have you here. So you've written this short essay for this collection about the importance and the value of community. And it seems to be tied to some of the things you've been talking about for a while now, this sense that many Americans feel isolated, they feel atomized, disconnected. Can you talk just generally about what drew you to write about community and what importance you think a sense of place might have in the democratic agenda?
Well, first of all, great to be with you, Osita. Great to be with Elizabeth. Always a fan and willing collaborator with Roosevelt on all the work that you guys are doing. Listen, this is an urgent matter for me because I just don't think you can mistake what's happening in this country. There is a real spiritual unspooling that is happening in America as fewer and fewer citizens and families feel like they have access to purposeful and meaningful lives. And I think that's what helps explain the fact that during the Biden administration, all the traditional economic indicators that we look to decide whether our economy is good or bad were telling us that it was good. Unemployment was really low, wages were going up, GDP was growing, and yet people were reporting that they were feeling worse and worse about their economic lives. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. A lot of it is that people, have jobs, but they feel really powerless in those jobs. They don't see the opportunity for advancement. Entrepreneurship is as a fantasy for many people. The centers of economic control in their community are further away from them than ever before. So they have a complaint about something that happens in an interaction at the hospital or something that's happening on their kid's smartphone. They have like no idea who to call and to complain to. People are lonely. The bonds between us have just been frayed. We're spending much less time with our neighbors and friends than ever before. There's a number of phenomenon that are playing out such that people aren't feeling great about sort of waking up every day with a sense of purpose and meaning, even though the economy by the numbers is doing well. The piece that I wrote, Osita, for Roosevelt was sort of specifically on this question of what it means to be a member of a tight-knit, well-defined local community. One of the things that has really frustrated people about this era of economic globalism, global integration, is that they don't really want to be a citizen of the world. I mean, that sort of sounds interesting to some, but it makes you feel very lonely if you're, one of billions. People want the community that defines their daily life to be discrete, to be unique, to be close to them. And yet, as our culture has been flattened, as our economy has become more global, as the local institutions that mattered have been bought up by private equity funds, as local journalism has disappeared, we don't know our neighbors. Technology has allowed us to, keep in really close contact with the closest ring of people to us, our immediate family and friends. Technology has allowed us to, create national level affinity groups in which we know every single day what's happening. If you're a fan of Taylor Swift or the Marvel universe, you're plugged in every day seamlessly to what's happening in the national scene on an affinity group that you belong to. But it's harder to know what your neighbors are up to. It's harder to stay plugged into what the people who live around the corner are doing. And I think that's where people outside of their connection to their immediate family find the most value, is in belonging to a neighborhood or a town, or a section of a city. That brings you pride, that brings you connection, that gives you a sense of broader selflessness in which you're living, not just for yourself or for your family, but for a group of people who are, a combination of friends and strangers and something in between. So, what I wrote about is, what are the policy ideas that could help rebuild healthier, more connected, more unique, more defined local communities. And is that a route towards helping people rescue the kind of meaning and purpose that has been lost from their lives? So again, really fortunate that you've given a lot of thought to this, and that Roosevelt creates a forum for us to talk about these maybe non-urgent, non-immediate issues that we've got to solve if we want to boost the health of the nation.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that is happening in this immediate moment is this big debate where a lot of it seems to be animated about this idea, from my reading, that it should be part of our national economic agenda to make sure that there's more housing in Brooklyn, make sure there's more housing in San Francisco, because that's where the opportunity is. And we ought to move people, or get people to move to these kinds of places where growth happens. There are things I like about the agenda, there are things I dislike, and I think that we should have more affordable housing in big cities. But it does seem to be in tension with some of the things you're talking about in this essay, this presumption that to be ready for the 21st century economy, or sort of to embrace growth, we need to take it for granted that people have to uproot themselves from the places they're familiar and move somewhere else. Does that feel like a fair reading to you? Are there kind of tensions between what you're kind of advocating for here, and the sense of place you're advocating for here, and this other, we got to get people into New York City to grow kind of idea?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think there's, an automatic tension between this agenda of more and an agenda of more connection and more meaning. I mean, it is true that part of what is driving people crazy today is this artificial culture of scarcity, in which there's so much wealth and power concentrated at the very top that people are laboring under an illusion that there really isn't enough for them. And so they end up viewing their neighbors instead of as neighbors and as people they should look after, as competitors. Everybody is a rival for the table scraps that are left over because we've reserved so much of wealth and income in this country for the people at the very top. An abundance agenda, certainly solves for that problem in that it would make the very rich even richer, but it would, provide for additional incomes, additional opportunities for the people that are feeling pretty lost. I don't think it solves the whole problem, though, because the question of who owns and who controls still does really matter to people at the local level. Um, it is deeply frustrating to Americans that power, economic power, political power exists so far away from them. And again, it used to be, that your chamber of commerce or your Rotary Club, that was full of powerful people. If something went wrong in your community, they had access to the levers that could help fix things. Now that's not true because your hospital is probably owned by some, faraway hospital ownership company. Most of the big employers in your district are owned by a shadowy private equity firm. The thing that matters most in your household these days, the device that matters most in your household, the phone, the smartphone, those apps are run by people who live a million miles away from you. If you have a complaint about the algorithm, good luck finding somebody to complain to. So if there's more of everything, but the centers of economic control are still a million miles away from communities, then I don't think that it entirely fixes this question of economic emasculation in our local communities. I think you also have to have an agenda of breaking up concentrated power and putting more power closer to the people who live in these communities.
So concretely, are there policies that really excite you that you think show a lot of promise when it comes to repairing some of your social bonds, creating more durable infrastructure in the whole of our communities? What ideas are you kind of circulating in your head about how to do some of those?
Well, I mean, certainly the broad agenda around breaking up concentrated corporate power is really important. And, taking laws that have kind of been dead letter on the books for a long time and enforcing them to make sure that we give real advantage to small businesses and the small employers that often, create that sense of identity for your local communities. So the more aggressive we are in breaking up these quasi-monopoly companies, the more aggressive we are in taking away some of the benefits that are handed to companies that exist at scale, and actually preferencing retail, for instance, that is locally owned. I think that's part of the solution. I think really trying to dig deep into what happened to local journalism and finding a way to perhaps even use some government resources to breathe new life into the ability of journalists to tell local stories. That's how I learned about my community, was the Wethersfield Post. Came once a week on Friday, but I gobbled up the Wethersfield Post even as a teenager because I wanted to know what my neighbors were doing, their successes, sometimes their embarrassments. But that made me feel close to my community. Institutions really matter, and that's a more delicate issue about what role government plays in supporting institutions that have weakened, like churches or labor unions. But there certainly are a set of policies that we could use to make religious institutions, which is where a lot of people find local connection, healthier. Certainly, we can have policies to help labor unions thrive, another place where people at the local level find connection. So, those are a set of early ideas that I think, would have the impact of making our local communities a little bit healthier, bringing power back to those communities, giving people more forums where they can find each other. Oh, and then one last one, just the pure government plays to create public spaces. One of the phenomenons that's happened all across the country is the closure of community pools. And that may sound kind of silly and trivial, but community pool for a lot of families is community. It is where you found your adult and children's friends for the summer. And so when those opportunities dry up, when only the high income communities can afford things like recreational sports leagues, a lot of people lose access to the place that they find their neighbors. So there are pure public investment plays to create platforms upon which people can connect that have been defunded, have atrophied, that we could breathe new life into.
Fantastic. And you talked a bit about at the top about the implications this agenda, thinking this way, it might have for democracy. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the implications of us not getting this right. What would they be? I mean, I think that when you start talking about localism, you start talking about small towns. For I think a lot of people, these are conservative coded ideas because they've already been so good at kind of talking at this level. It feels immediate to people. So, if we don't kind of change course here, if we don't at least have a response to the way conservatives and sort of valorize community, what do you think the implications are moving forward for our democracy?
Well, I think the desire for unique, tight local communities is really apolitical and not ideological. The real danger of continuing to live in a world where we are trending away from connection to our neighbors is that it does feed these really demagogic narratives at the national level about our neighbors being threats to us. If nobody in your immediate family is gay, and because you're so disconnected from your community, you don't know anybody personally that is gay or transgender, then maybe you are much more willing to believe the narrative that transgender kids or drag shows are the biggest cultural and economic threat to the nation. If you don't know people who believe something different from you, your whole family are Democrats and you don't really know any kind of cultural conservatives, you may believe the narrative that everybody who doesn't believe in sort of the full panoply of civil rights is morally bankrupt, is evil, is a threat to the health of the nation. So I think connection to the community is a way for people to kind of test whether the narratives of division that they're being handed by national political figures actually square with reality. And in that way, it really seems like that reconnection with your neighbors and community is essential for democracy to survive.
Fantastic. I was told you had until 5 to, so one last question. Tell us a little bit about your own hometown and where you grew up and how that sort of animated your thinking about politics and how you come to think about the value of community in general.
Yeah, I grew up in Wethersfield, Connecticut, a kind of middle income suburb of Hartford, not terribly affluent. But I had a sense that it was a real distinct, unique place. It's the oldest town in Connecticut, and so we had a real kind of sense of our history. I remember taking part in the it must have been the 250th anniversary celebration of the founding of our town. That was a really big deal for Wethersfield. I remember that local paper. I remember participating in youth sports and the connection that I made to people I didn't know otherwise through those sports. I remember church. I didn't end up being a particularly religious adult, but I remember the institution, the First Church, and I remember the people I met there and being taught the value of selflessness and stopping and shaking hands with my neighbors in the pews every morning to remind myself that I was connected to everybody, whether they were strangers or not. I remember a family in which one income was enough to be able for all of us to live a dignified life. That my mother did get to stay home for a period of my upbringing to take care of us. We had safety and security. We felt like we had power. So my community, my sense of localness was a really big deal for me growing up. I don't live in that community now, but I live just on the other side of the border. My parents never left. A very big part of who I believe I am today is rooted in Wethersfield, Connecticut. I'm happier as an adult. I was happier as a child because I belonged to a strong local community with people that cared about each other. And I think we've lost that. Not for everyone, not everywhere, but less people have access to that sense of grounding in local community that I had. And I think that it's not too late to repair for that.
Well, Senator, this has been terrific. A terrific message, thought-provoking message, and I'm so glad you took the time to share it with us today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Asita.
Well, hey, good to see you. So that was a great conversation, and I think it's just a preview of this wonderful, wonderful, very big collection. Now, I also do this. I had no idea so many other people were going to be writing. I don't know if I even knew that the senator was going to be writing, but you've really put together a wonderful collection, thought-provoking, generative, and I think promising ideas for a progressive economic agenda. And I'm so glad I was able to be a part of it. You've written yourself uh, a great lead essay, but also a particular essay on some of the ideas that have been most interesting to you. But I always thought I could sort of start chatting with you in broad terms. Why do you think economic democracy is a kind of good frame for the many, many different ideas that you'll find in this collection? And what does that phrase actually mean to you?
Yeah, so this is, I think, pretty near and dear to my heart, this idea that democracy and the economy go together. My theory, I think this is probably fair enough to say about you as well as me, Osita, is that people like you and me, we love the true mechanics of democracy. The mechanics and the ideals are deeply important, but most people think about the ordinary facets of their life, right? They think about what it's like to go to work. They think about whether or not they know what their shift is going to be tomorrow. They think about whether they have a plan for getting their kids to school or not, whether there's an option for care if they can't get their kids to school. They think about whether once in a while they're able to take their family out to eat or go camping for a weekend. Those are the things that both concern people and also excite people about the lives that they're going to lead. Not to mention the things that we were just talking about with Senator Murphy, their connection to their community and their hometown and the institutions around them. And so I think that while I personally love the voting booth, most people are looking to whether the way that democratic institutions show up in their lives enhance or detract from that life that they want to lead. And how we think about democracy has a lot to do with whether we think that the economy is delivering for us or not. I lead not just any institute, but the Roosevelt Institute, founded on the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And I think we have a great lesson to learn from the way in which Franklin Roosevelt saved our democracy in a moment of peril when it truly was competing with various forms of authoritarianism for legitimacy, right? We were in an economic crisis, and there really was a question of whether democracy was capable of delivering an economy that people could see themselves in. And it was a moment where people were truly curious about places like fascist Italy and whether or not that was actually a better political system because it could deliver prosperity and security for people. And the thing that he did, and the lesson that I think we are well to remember in this moment, was that actually the government in a democratic fashion had to deliver on the economy to convince people to stay true to those ideals. So far from being disconnected political and economic ideas, these things really have to be woven together. And the last thing I'll say about the plethora of essays in this collection is that if we're going to understand our economy and our democracy to be connected, we have to understand what it is people want to deliver. I think want delivered. These essays take on various aspects of what the economy does or doesn't do and what people do or don't want from it, which helps us remember the breadth and texture of what it is that we need to present to people to remind them of why our democratic institutions are so important.
So one of the ideas that you talk about in the essay that I think actually connects to something the senator said is this idea of opening up and democratizing regulatory processes. One of the things that the senator said was that people don't feel like they're connected to the actual levers of power. We might talk about democracy, but people feel distant or removed from the places that decisions are being made. It feels like the concept of opening up regulatory processes, democratizing them somehow, could address some of that feeling. So can you talk about that idea and what it actually means to democratize the agency?
I love this question, and I think it's so important to be asking at this moment. It's a hard moment to be talking about democratic institutions when we have an administration that is um, taking a deliberate chainsaw, as it were, to many of them. I don't think any of us who believe in government would have asked for this moment, but also think that one should never waste a crisis. I served in the Biden administration and the Obama administration before it. And I can tell you, we shouldn't forget that the institutions that we were trying to run in government weren't the ones that we would have designed if we had had the pen. They are, the executive branch in particular is the product of, now 5 decades of kind of failing belief in the power of government to deliver for people, of kind of market first policies and a deregulatory agenda that had at its heart the idea that government should step back, that it should not shape markets, that it should not invest. And so over the last 4 years, what we were met with was an ambitious economic policy agenda crashing into administrative agencies that are no longer designed to be fit for purpose, that no longer have the muscles to deliver strong industrial policy, that no longer have the wherewithal to shape markets the way that's needed. We have an opportunity now, as I see it, not just to rebuild agencies the way they were before, but to think about a true renewal and reconstruction of the executive branch in a way that is fit for purpose for the kind of policy that we want to deliver. And that both is important on the substantive side and on the process side. I think we need to reconstruct agencies that are outcome oriented rather than process oriented, that are nimble, and that are responsive. And then to your particular question, that are built to both intake on the front end, democratic input as a part of the agenda setting, and then to be responsive vocally and visibly as we deliver. I actually think, my experience at the Federal Trade Commission was a really good one for this. So I can give you a couple of kind of examples of what this looks like. On the front end, we opened the agency radically to the public. We had open dockets that asked big questions, not just specific policy ones, but things like, tell us every unfair contract that you're subject to in the economy and tell us why you don't like them. We had open commission meetings where anyone could come and testify about whatever they wanted, whatever kind of problem they were having in the marketplace, whether or not it had to do with the agenda that we had for the commissioners to talk about. And the reason to do that is because we can't expect people to come in and say, hey, I have a consumer protection problem. I have an antitrust problem. I have a banking regulation problem. What people have is an instinct that something is unfair in the marketplace. And it's our job as government, as experts, to listen to that problem and say, how do we diagnose that on a structural level? And what tools do we have to address it? Making sure that agencies are radically open in that way can make sure that we are adequately and accurately diagnosing which are the problems that are most urgent for people to see solved in their lives and how can we do that. It also helps us make sure that economic regulators aren't captured by the industries that they're regulating, right? If we open up our agencies on the front end and create accountability mechanisms to the broad public, that's one way to make sure that we are actually regulating the economy for the public good.
Yeah, that sounds terrific to me. And one of the reasons why I think economic democracy is such a good frame is that it encompasses so much. It encompasses that priority, that aspiration. We need to make sure that the agencies are regulating the economy are democratically accountable. In my own book, the frame that I kind of, the set of policies that I focus on are labor policies. So we need to make sure the workers are empowered at work, that they have agency at work. We rebuild what unions offered us, but also move beyond them and expand worker power in new ways. But when I give the book to antitrust people, they're like, well, economic democracy should also be a matter of making sure that our economic lives aren't dominated by a few corporations and breaking up the big ones. And you actually talk specifically in your essay about the points of connection between labor policy and antitrust policy, being better about, advancing ideas that, join together those two agendas, and those two kinds of schools of progressive policymaking. Now, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that idea. How should we kind of take labor and antitrust together as priorities in an economic, democratic frame?
So first of all, I think there's a really rich history here, of labor, the farmers' movement, the anti-monopoly movement joining together in a kind of coalition of folks looking for more liberty and agency as against the ever burgeoning and larger corporate interests in the economy. That's, thinking back to the progressives in the late 1800s, early 1900s that brought us the antitrust laws to begin with. That was a true labor, farmer, small business, anti-monopoly monopoly coalition of people looking for a more democratic economy, just to flip the words for a second. So there's a deep history of kind of alliances in this vein. I think that, today's anti-monopoly and labor movements share a core belief still, which is there needs to be less power in the hands of monopolistic corporations and more power in the hands of a broad array of other market participants and stakeholders. I think the difference you see is there's a real difference in the kind of primary tactic used, right? For the anti-monopoly movement, the state is a core actor. Its ability to regulate and its ability to enforce, whether that's actually the antitrust laws or a much broader array of industry-specific regulations that ensure that each industry has marketplaces that are dynamic. And there's a whole set of tools, not just antitrust, but a whole set of regulatory tools that, in some ways we have forgotten, but have a long American history of using, like structural separations, like public options to discipline markets, all kinds of interventions on the part of the state to ensure that we are actually shaping markets to deliver competition, innovation, entrepreneurship, as well as a strong labor market, worker power, and choice and low prices for consumers. So that's anti-monopoly on the one hand. Labor also seeks to constrain the power of concentrated corporate interest, but from another direction, by building countervailing power to act as a counter. And that is in some ways also oriented towards the state, making sure that the state isn't captured, making sure that there is a voice for workers, not just in their workplace, but also in their democracy. But it also delivers something else that's really important that you write about so eloquently, which is that voice and power in the workplace, right? Building countervailing power is if anti-monopoly power sort of opens the space in the economy for more dynamism, more liberty, more opportunity, more freedom. Building countervailing power kind of actually builds the structures within which ordinary people can exercise that voice, can have a say in the working conditions in their workplace, on the way to also building political power. So there's a real shared identity in terms of the kind of goals of these political projects, rebalancing power in the economy and over our state institutions. There is sometimes a difference in tactic, and whenever that happens, there can be a tension or a difference in kind of what's important, what goes first, how it's deployed. But there is a historical alliance there that's really important, and a huge amount of opportunity and overlap, I think, in this moment for alliances. I think there's some theoretical work that needs to happen. This gets a little bit less idealistic and a little bit more wonky, but in a world in which we have lived with a very thin and brittle version of neoclassical economics that informs our antitrust enforcement, we're dealing with a set of economics that really doesn't do a very good job of describing the markets that we want to make more competitive. And that's true for labor economics just as it is for other economics. And so we have work to do to figure out how we can update our economic models to better describe what's happening in labor markets, to better account for the market power that employers exercise over their workers, in order to make sure that we are deploying our laws in a way that actually accounts for how labor markets work, and accounts for the importance of power and collective bargaining in those markets. So we have some analytical work to do, which I think ladders up to some enforcement policy and policy in order to bring those movements and those sort of intellectual traditions together.
So you're talking to us about some of the great things that the last administration was able to accomplish when it came to competition policy at the FTC and elsewhere. One of the sort of the things that people have been anxious about or sort of grumbling about the last year or so is that it feels like the administration didn't get credit for some of those pro-competition accomplishments. And when I was reading your essay, it struck me that there are things in it that I had not heard very many policymakers say before in sort of the principles of what was animating the agenda. So you talk about liberty from fear, for instance, this idea that you write that we should be invested in competition because having the particular sector, particular industry dominated by one kind of company, one firm, leaves us vulnerable in ways that we shouldn't accept. And we fear, as you write, the crucial business inputs becoming unavailable, your access to customers being cut off, being trapped in a job with no control of your workload, of your economic security, and your livelihood being fully out of your control. The concept of liberty in that sense is not something I've heard very much from policymakers. And it seems to be such a useful and powerful way of talking about the issue beyond the kind of wonky that we're often accustomed to speaking of these people who work and do things, who think things. So when it comes to ideas like liberty, or when it comes to ideas like economic democracy, how important do you think it is for policymakers to talk about these principles when they're explaining the policy accomplishments or the policy goals?
I think it's absolutely crucial for us all to be talking about what's at stake when we're talking about policies or the policy agenda that we are proposing. One of my favorite moments being at the FTC was at the Anti-Monopoly Summit put on by the American Economic Liberties Institute and Project, and Lena Khan, then chair of the FTC, was delivering a keynote speech. And her speech was, in fact, all about fear. From my perspective now at the Roosevelt Institute, very delighted to say that, the frame was freedom from fear, right? And what she was saying was concentrated corporate power is a huge impediment to people living a life without coercion and with opportunity, and explaining in particular with respect to our proposal to ban non-compete clauses in labor contracts. She was explaining the voices that we had heard in our rulemaking process from workers saying, not just, hey, if I'm trapped in this job, I can't bid up my wages. I can't go get another job where I'd be paid more, et cetera, but truly wrenching stories that we got about, workers trapped in situations where they felt sexually harassed and they couldn't leave. Workers, frankly, who had religious liberties concerns, maybe even workers who didn't believe in the COVID vaccine, but there was a vaccine mandate and they couldn't get another job because of their non-compete. Stories that of all kinds of ways in which people's jobs correlated with their other values in life, and the fact that their employer could exercise this amount of power over them, coercive power over them, prevented them from living the lives that they wanted. And she did absolutely kind of make that connection. And what struck me was that the Anti-Monopoly Summit was like not your typical Washington, D.C. gathering of policymakers. We had there small business owners, entrepreneurs, innovators, workers, labor unions, individual people who felt as though they were a part of this burgeoning anti-monopoly movement. So she wasn't talking to your inside the beltway policy wonks. She was talking to people. And that speech resonated so deeply because people finally felt like they might be in kind of a call and response relationship to their government. They felt like they had been calling out and said, and I will just say this is like a little bit reversed. They felt as though they had been calling out with these frustrations, with these fears, with this limitations on their lives, and no one had been listening. And finally, they had a government official who was both talking in the register that they were feeling and also doing something that was directly connected to that register and those feelings. That to me is the virtuous cycle of democratic legitimacy when people see themselves reflected in both the way that their politicians and leaders are talking and in the actions that they're taking. So I think not only is it important to speak in the language of the kinds of um, coercion and limitations that people experience and the kind of agency that they wish they had and the kind of security that they wish they had, but also not just at the back end, with respect to messaging, but at the front end of policy development, when we are figuring out what is the agenda that we are going to set, and also what is the design of the policy that's going to resonate. Just to go back to this non-compete example, we didn't propose a partial ban or a presumption or something else that would be kind of scalpely tailored based on sort of pure expertise. We proposed something that was understandable, that people could hold on to, and that the bigness of it felt commensurate to the urgency with which people were feeling the problem. So, to carry your question through, yes, I think it's important for our leaders to talk in the language of liberty and the register of emotion. But I also think it's important for our leaders to walk the walk, which is to say, to take those baseline feelings and bake them into the policy design and the policy solutions that we propose so that we complete that virtuous cycle.
Fantastic. So we've got a couple of questions that people have been sending in. I think I'm going to take this last portion of our time here to throw some of them to you, or just to both of us, as it may be the case. We have a question up top about some of what Senator Murphy said. So this question says, the loss of community and community institutions is a really important issue that Senator Murphy has surfaced, but it stood out to me that one of the institutions she saw as important was families set up with one parent home and one in the workforce. Is this institutions that hold up the community the right list as a new institutions that we need that don't just point the way back to the communities were structured in the past? How do we get people to think creatively about this problem and not just nostalgic thinking? Obviously, people at Roosevelt have been working a lot on building the pair economy, building an economy that works for all people, not premised on kind of old ways of thinking about who belongs in the workplace and who isn't. But what do you think about that general question? I mean, when we think about the importance of rootedness and restructuring our communities or rebuilding our communities, what are some of the novel ways we can think about the relation of home and work life? And what are the policies that could sort of do what Senator Murphy wants to do, but sort of built upon 21st century understanding of equality and economic justice and freedom?
I'm really glad to get an opportunity to address this question. So a couple of things. I think I've heard a lot of times from many folks, Senator Murphy and others, this idea of a longing for a moment where a family could survive on a single income. Here's how I actually take this. Where we are now is that people are surviving on cobbling together multiple jobs, some of which don't have the benefits that we need, many of which don't include the stability that anybody needs. And that is a truly horrible place to be. It's a thing that we've been ignoring, frankly, for a really long time, just how awful that feels. So I can understand a longing for a moment where it felt like jobs were stable, jobs were well-paying, jobs came with benefits, not just in the near term, like health insurance, but pensions for the long term. The giving up of that stability and in its place, leaving behind the absolute precarity that people live in now is a truly awful trade-off that people have had to make. That dynamic doesn't mean we have to go backwards, as the commenter says. I think, though, that we have a challenge, right? It's easy to paint a vision of something that people think they already know. It is so much harder to paint an irresistible vision of something that we've never seen. But I think we kind of know the elements, right? We could spend a lot of time looking backwards towards a world of manufacturing that we no longer have. Or we could recognize that we have now a predominantly service economy, and our challenge, our great challenge, is to figure out how do we make those service economy jobs good jobs for everybody. Jobs that have dignity, that are attractive, no matter who you are. How do we tackle the problem that if we make service jobs good jobs, those might increase prices for people at a moment when one of the other sources of instability and insecurity is not only the fact that we just went through a global pandemic, but then prices rose, creating a real kind of sense of dislocation and disorientation. I, for one, think that means that we're going to have to think a lot more about deep public investments in places like childcare to make sure that we can meet those twin goals: good, stable service jobs, along with long-term cost structures that make housing, childcare, healthcare, and other cost centers for families more affordable. The other thing that I would say about the connection between community and family life, Senator Murphy gave an explanation of the community that he grew up in. And it made me think of the community that I feel extraordinarily lucky to live in today, one that I wish more Americans could have. I am a Washingtonian born and bred. I grew up in Southwest, which is now entirely different. For those of you who live in DC, you know what the wharf development looks like. I now live in Mount Pleasant. It's a really tight-knit community, close together townhomes, good, diverse public school, diverse both economically and racially. And I am a part of a family with two working parents. As you can imagine, I have a job that requires me to travel and do all kinds of things, and we have two little children. And we don't pay for extra childcare. The kids go to after school at their school. But what we have is like an incredible community. On my block, there's probably 10 or 15 kids that are 10 years old or younger. Every parent feels responsible for every child. The alley is dead ends in Rock Creek Park, and so the kids can go play together unsupervised while parents need to work. We have neighbors who take our children for 1 week a year while we're in school so we can get away, and we do the same for them. We have a thick network of friends and neighbors, and it is truly the village that helps us raise our children while we also, both me and my husband, get to pursue the lives that we want to lead. I think very few Americans get to live in a community like that anymore. That's the kind of community that allows us to choose. I took a year off. It was a phenomenal year of rest and rejuvenation. I'm back at a crazy job. My husband has been at his crazy job. It's not about, whether we can survive on one income or whether we need two incomes. It is, we live in a community. We have the income, we have the cost structures that we can configure our family, both nuclear and broadly, to support all four of us in our family flourishing. That's what I think we want for every American. And right now, it's only afforded to the privileged few like me and my family. And I think that's what we want to share with everybody.
Yeah, I think you are so right. I mean, we could go for another half hour just on just on going back and forth on what you said. But I think that that is so central, really, to how I've come to think about democracy, broadly speaking. I mean, I think that ultimately democracy is about agency. We want to have the ability to control, shape our lives to the extent that we can, just that we have. And you can configure life in all kinds of ways. You should be able to, as a free agent, somebody with real and true freedom. It doesn't have to look like a particular model of people working or being at home. It doesn't have to look like a particular kind of community. The people should have the choice and the freedom. And I think one of the things that is so troubling about this economy is that people don't. They're forced into structures. They're forced into ways of working that limit their freedom and limit their ability to choose. They're forced them into having lifestyles or having their home structure in a particular way that they would not choose if it were up to them. And government doesn't really seem responsive to them. And I think that that contributes to the kind of lack of faith people have in the concept of democracy. How can you talk about democracy when it's the case that there is no place in my life? Has there really ever been any place in my life where I really do exercise real choices about the way things ought to be? And so I think that the essays in this collection all do at different aspects of that fundamental problem, that fundamental challenge. There's no one answer, there's no one solution, but I think that what we have here are the beginnings of an agenda that can really deliver agency to people, and that feels aspirational in this way. We're not just talking about policy in this kind of wonky sense. Again, we're talking about some of the principles that shape society and shape the way that we live. I think that's really exciting and refreshing to people for whom I think politics can seem boring and not really relevant. I want people, if they so choose, to have a life where they can live the life of a Mount Pleasant resident. I always tell people it's a very appropriately named neighborhood, and this kind of idol that I think many Americans would choose if they could, but unfortunately, we haven't built an economy where people can do that. I think that's kind of the task we have. That's all that. So
I couldn't
anyway,
agree more. I couldn't agree more. And I feel like that's a pretty good summation of the conversation we have had today. And many of the things that we at Roosevelt are hoping to explore. I just want to quickly close, Osita, by saying thank you so much, both for your contribution to the essay collection and to your contributions today. Thank you to Senator Murphy as well for his contributions. Thanks to all of you who have joined us today. And I really encourage you to take a look at the full set of essays. It is a really incredible group of people who are dedicated to a brighter future. And I think we are trying to start the conversation now, not just for where we are, but for finding some inspirations for a North Star for where we need to go. Thank you.